The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the third week of October when Nora Calloway had exactly $17.40 to her name. She knew the precise amount because she had counted it twice the night before, sitting at the kitchen table after Wren had gone to bed, sorting through the coins and the single crumpled bill with the careful attention of someone who understood that $17 was not nothing, but it was close enough to nothing that the difference hardly mattered. The bank notice was still on the table beside her coffee cup. 30 days. That was what the man at First Oklahoma Savings had told her. In the tone people use when they are delivering bad news, they have practiced delivering many times before. 30 days to bring the loan current or the property would enter foreclosure proceedings. He had slid a pamphlet across the desk about financial counseling services, and Nora had taken it because refusing would have required more energy than she had left. She had driven home through the flat brown Oklahoma landscape with the pamphlet on the passenger seat and the radio off, and she had sat in the truck in the driveway for a long time before going inside. The farm had been Clem's dream more than hers, if she was being honest with herself, which she tried to be in the quiet moments. Clem had grown up reading about land and what a man could build on it, and when they married in 1998, he had talked about the farm, the way other men talked about their children, with a tenderness that was almost embarrassing to witness. She had loved him for it. She had loved the way he walked the fence lines in the early morning, checking for breaks, and the way he knew the name of every piece of equipment in the equipment shed, and the way he looked at her across the dinner table like she was something he had not expected to deserve. He had been gone 2 years now. A January morning in 2007 ice on the county road, and then he was simply gone the way people go when the world decides it is done with them. Wren had been 14, Nora had been 36, and had not known yet how long the next 2 years would feel. She was 38 now, and the farm was failing, and the $17 sat on the kitchen table like a verdict. The morning the letter came, Nora was in the barn when she heard the mail truck on the gravel road. She finished checking the latch on the hay storage before she walked back to the house unhurried, because the mail had not brought anything good in long enough that she had stopped expecting it to. Patch, the old shepherd mix who had been Wren's dog first, and then everyone's dog, and now since Clem seemed to have appointed himself Nora's particular responsibility, trotted alongside her with his ears up and his tail making slow arcs. The envelope was yellowed in the way that paper goes yellow, not from age alone, but from having been held and set down and held again many times over many years. Her name was written on the front in handwriting that was precise and slightly cramped, the handwriting of someone who had learned penmanship when penmanship still meant something. The return address listed a name she did not recognize, Silas Marsh, and a location in Mineral County, Nevada that meant nothing to her. She stood on the porch and turned the envelope over once before opening it. Inside were 3 things: a letter handwritten on 2 sheets of the same yellowed paper, a legal document notarized and stamped that appeared to be a property deed, and a photograph. She read the letter first. It was not long. Silas Marsh introduced himself as her mother's brother, her uncle by blood, a man she had never heard mentioned in any conversation in her entire life. He wrote that he understood this would come as a surprise. He wrote that he was sorry he had not found a way to be present in her life, and that the reasons for his absence were complicated and not entirely his own choices to make. He wrote that he was leaving her 200 acres of land in Mineral County, Nevada, and everything on it. He wrote that she should look for what he could not take with him. He wrote in the final line in handwriting that was slightly shakier than the rest, as though he had tired by the end. Look for what I couldn't take with me. The answer stands where the old oak grows alone. The legal document confirmed what the letter said. The land was hers. The deed had been filed and recorded. A lawyer in Reno named Harlan Oakes had handled the paperwork. She looked at the photograph last. The man in it was standing in front of a plain wooden fence with flat desert land behind him, and the first thing that struck her was how much he looked like her. Not in a vague family resemblance way, but in a specific and almost unsettling way. The same jaw, the same set of the eyes, the same quality of stillness in the posture that Nora had always thought of as her own particular characteristic. He looked to be perhaps 35 or 40 in the photograph. The image was slightly faded, the colors muted in the way of photographs from the early 1970s. On the back in handwriting, she recognized from the letter as Silas's, someone had written two lines. The first line said, Agnes, 1973. The second line said, I'll watch over her girl when you can't. Agnes was her mother's name. Nora sat down on the porch steps because her legs had made the decision before her mind did. Patch settled beside her, pressing his warm flank against her knee, and she held the photograph and let the arithmetic of it move through her slowly. 1973. She had been 2 years old in 1973. Her mother, Agnes Marsh, before she became Agnes Calloway, had been alive and apparently in contact with this brother that Nora had never known existed. And this brother had made some kind of promise about watching over a child who was at that point barely old enough to walk. Her mother had died in 2001, 8 years ago, and she had never once said the name Silas Marsh. Nora was still sitting on the steps when Wren came out of the house with her school bag over one shoulder and a piece of toast in her hand and stopped when she saw her mother's face. What is it? Wren said. It was not quite a question. Nora handed her the photograph without speaking. Wren looked at it for a moment, turned it over, read the back, and looked at her mother. Who is Agnes? Wren said. Your grandmother, Nora said. My mother. Wren looked at the photograph again. And who is he? That is apparently my uncle, Nora said. A man I have never heard of in my life. Wren sat down on the step beside her, the toast forgotten in her hand, and read the letter twice through with the focused attention she brought to everything. The same quality of concentration that had earned her the highest marks in her class every year since fourth grade, and that had, 2 months ago, generated a letter from the University of Oklahoma about a scholarship program for exceptional rural students. A letter that Nora had found tucked in the back of Wren's desk drawer because Wren had not shown it to her, had not wanted to add one more thing to the pile of things Nora was already carrying. Nora had found the letter while looking for a pencil. She had read it standing at Wren's desk and then put it back exactly as she found it and had not said anything because what was there to say? The scholarship required a family financial statement. The financial statement would show what it would show. He left you land, Wren said now, folding the letter carefully along its original creases. 200 acres of what a county record somewhere apparently calls unproductive land, Nora said. Wren looked out at the flat Oklahoma fields, brown and tired at the end of a dry season. Are you going to go? Nora looked at the deed in her hand, then at the photograph, then at the horizon. She thought about 30 days. She thought about $17.40. She thought about the financial counseling pamphlet on the kitchen table and what it would mean to let the farm go and what Clem would have thought about that. And then she stopped thinking about what Clem would have thought, because that particular line of thought had a way of closing doors she needed to keep open. I don't see that I have much to lose, she said. They left the next morning. Nora arranged for the Petworth family 3 miles down the road to check on the remaining livestock, packed 2 bags loaded Patch into the back seat, and drove west on Route 270 with the deed and the photograph in the glove compartment and approximately 400 miles of highway between Oklahoma and Nevada. Wren navigated from an atlas and read aloud from it occasionally, naming towns they were passing through with the detached interest of someone cataloging information they might need later. Patch slept with his chin on the backseat armrest and his breath fogging the window. They drove through the afternoon and into the evening and stopped at a roadside motel in the Texas Panhandle, where the room smelled of old carpet and the ice machine in the hallway made a sound like distant thunder. Nora lay on her bed in the dark and listened to Wren's breathing even out into sleep and thought about a man who looked like her standing in front of a fence in 1973 making a promise to her mother. She did not sleep much. The property in Mineral County was 3 miles off the county road on a dirt track that the truck's suspension registered as an ongoing complaint. When they arrived in the late morning of the second day, Nora stopped the truck and sat looking through the windshield for a moment before getting out. The ranch house was what the word abandoned truly meant. Not the romantic version of abandoned that appears in stories, but the real version where time and weather and the absence of attention have collaborated to reduce something to its essentials. The boards on the exterior walls had gone gray, and some had come loose, hanging at angles. The windows were empty frames, the glass long since gone, in some of them cardboard stuffed into others as a measure that had solved nothing. The porch roof had partially collapsed on the left side, the wood sagging down in a tired bow. The barn 20 yards behind the house looked as though a determined wind could settle the question of whether it was still standing. Wren got out and stood beside the truck with her hands in her jacket pockets, looking at the house with an expression that gave nothing away. "It's something," she said finally. "It's something," Nora agreed. Patch was already moving through the scrubby grass around the base of the porch, nose down, reading whatever the ground had to tell him. He stopped near the bottom step, stiffened, and began to dig with sudden, purposeful energy at something half buried in the dirt. Wren moved to look. "Mom," she called, "come see this." Buried just below the surface near the base of the porch step was a metal box about the size of a shoebox, its surface thick with rust, the lid sealed with corrosion and years. Nora pried it open with a flathead screwdriver from the truck's toolbox, working at the seam until the lid gave way with a sound like a seal breaking. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had kept it dry and intact, were three objects. The first was a hand-drawn map on heavy paper, the lines precise and deliberate, showing what appeared to be the property from above, with a series of symbols marked at various points. The symbols were not immediately readable, geometric shapes, circles, and squares arranged in a pattern that suggested system without making the system obvious. The second was a key. It was heavier than it looked, with the dense particular weight of something that was not hollow, the metal worn smooth by years of handling but not tarnished. Along the shaft, barely visible without the right angle of light, were numbers engraved so small they required squinting to read. A sequence, possibly coordinates, possibly a combination, possibly something else entirely. The third was another photograph. In this one, two people stood under a large oak tree, a tree so distinctly large and solitary in what appeared to be the same flat Nevada landscape that it would have been notable from a distance. The woman on the left was her mother, younger than Nora had ever known her, perhaps 25, laughing at something outside the frame. The man beside her was Silas, and he was laughing too. On the back, in her mother's handwriting this time, not Silas's SM and AM, 1976. "What's buried stays buried until the right hands find it." "The right hands," Nora said quietly. Wren was looking at the photograph over her shoulder. "That's Grandma Agnes. I recognize her from the other pictures." "Yes, she looks happy." Nora looked at her mother's face in the photograph, the unself-conscious openness of it, the way the laughter had caught her mid-motion. She had known her mother mostly as a quiet woman, careful and a little sad, in the way people are sad when something has cost them something they cannot name. She had not often seen this version of her mother. They spent the first hour searching the house, moving through the rooms, with the systematic patience that Nora had learned from years of looking for things on a farm, where things were always being misplaced or buried under other things. The house had been emptied, or had emptied itself over time, the furniture reduced to the frames of a few pieces, the kitchen stripped to bare counters, and a rusted pump at the sink. In the back bedroom, the floor was bare boards, except for a rectangle near the window, where the boards were slightly different, slightly newer, replaced at some point after the rest of the floor had been laid. Wren went to her knees and pressed her palms flat against the different boards and found the one that moved. Below it, in a space that had been carefully sealed against moisture with tar paper and strips of aluminum flashing, was a book. A journal bound in dark leather that was dry and intact, the kind of book a man buys when he intends to use it seriously. Nora carried it to the window where the light was better and opened it to the first page. Silas Marsh had begun keeping the journal in 1969. The early entries were brief and businesslike, recording purchases at estate sales and auctions, the names of coins and their grades and the prices paid. An 1881 Morgan silver dollar in near mint condition, purchased at an estate sale in Elko for $32. A 1916 D Mercury dime, found in a collection, being sold by the granddaughter of a man who had not known what he had, purchased for what the entry described only as considerably less than its value. The entries tracked a man who was patient, methodical, and who understood something that most people at most estate sales did not understand, which was that the people selling rarely knew what they were selling. As the years passed, the entries changed. The purchases became larger. The language became more careful. Names appeared and disappeared. Other collectors, dealers, auction houses. And then, beginning in the early 1980s, a different quality entered the writing. Something that was not quite paranoia, but was adjacent to it. A recurring concern about attention, about being seen, about certain people who seemed to be taking an interest in what he was building. Nora flipped forward, reading selectively, catching the shape of it. She stopped at an entry from 1991. Sold 2 pieces to a private buyer in Denver. The collection is worth more than I allow myself to think about directly. Eleanor used to say that large numbers have a way of making people strange, and she was right about that, as she was right about most things. I keep the knowledge of what I have in the same place. I keep the memory of her, which is to say carefully and at a slight distance, so it does not change how I see things. Eleanor. Nora read the name twice. Her mother's full name had been Agnes Eleanor Marsh. No one had ever called her Eleanor except apparently her brother. She kept reading. Entry after entry, the collection growing, the anxiety around it sharpening. And then on a page toward the back of the first journal, an entry that made her stop. Agnes came to see me last spring. She is worried about the girl, says she has her father's stubbornness and my patience, and that the combination is going to be either very useful or very dangerous, depending on what life puts in front of her. I told her I would watch over the girl the best way I know how, which is from a distance and through what I leave behind. Agnes thinks I am wrong to stay away. She may be right. But I have learned that there are some kinds of love that are better expressed through planning than through presence, the girl Nora said. She is talking about me. Wren had been reading over her shoulder. She didn't say anything, but she moved closer. There were 3 journals in total, each one continuing from the last, covering 40 years of accumulation and careful record-keeping. Nora read the relevant sections while Wren moved around the house, examining walls and floors and the spaces behind empty built-in shelves. The picture that emerged from the journals was of a man who had spent 4 decades building something extraordinary and largely invisible. A collection of rare American coins that, by his own careful accounting, based on auction records and private appraisals noted in the margins of the later journals, was worth somewhere in excess of $100 million. 100 million, Wren said. She had been listening while Nora read passages aloud. That is what he wrote. From old coins that most people sold for nothing because they did not know what they had. Patch barked once from somewhere outside. Not his alarm bark, something more puzzled. Nora looked up from the journal. Then she heard the engine. The vehicle that came up the dirt track was a black Cadillac that had no business on a road like this, and the man who got out of it was wearing a charcoal suit that had no business in the Nevada desert. He was perhaps 50, with the kind of face that had been carefully maintained, the kind of tan that came from golf courses rather than work, the kind of posture that announced itself before the words did. He extended his hand when he reached the porch steps and smiled the particular smile of a man who had practiced smiling until it no longer required thought. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "my name is Richard Voss. I represent Consolidated Land Development. I understand you recently came into possession of this property." Nora did not take the hand. "How do you know about that?" "We arrived this morning." Something crossed his face too quickly to name and was gone. "We monitor property transfers in the county," he said. "It's standard practice for a development company with interests in the region." His eyes moved past her to the interior of the house and then back to her face, and she had the distinct impression that what he was actually looking for was not the house, but something in it. "I'm here to make your life considerably simpler. Mrs. Calloway," he continued, "this land is problematic. No water rights attached to the deed, soil composition that makes agricultural use impractical, no road access beyond this track. Whatever your late relative imagined this property was worth, I can tell you from our surveys that the realistic market value is quite low. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 cash for the property in its entirety." The transaction could close in 72 hours. $50,000 was more money than Nora had seen in one place in 2 years. $50,000 was the bank loan with enough left over. She felt Ren beside her go very still the way she went still when she was computing something. Nora said, "That seems like a generous offer for worthless land." Voss's smile did not change, but something behind it shifted by a fraction. "I'm a businessman, Mrs. Calloway. I see potential where the average person sees problems. The offer stands for 48 hours. He left in the Cadillac back down the dirt track, and Nora watched until the dust settled. "He knew we were here," Ren said. "We have been here for 3 hours." Nora was watching the place where the car had been. He also looked at the journal. "Did you see it?" When his eyes went to the doorway. "I saw it." They went back inside, and Nora read the final entry in the third journal, the one dated 8 weeks before Silas Marsh's death in August of 2009. The handwriting was shakier here, the letters larger, the spaces between words uneven in the way of someone writing through physical difficulty. "Voss has been circling this property for 3 years," the entry read. "He knows something is here. He has tried to purchase the land 4 times at prices I have refused. I do not know precisely what he knows, but I know what he is. There are men who build things and men who take things, and I have been watching Richard Voss long enough to know which kind he is. Agnes's girl is struggling now. The time is coming. I have arranged for everything she will need. The collection is in 12 locations. The map shows where. The key opens the first door. The tree will tell her the rest. And if Voss comes before she is ready, position W will tell her what she needs to know. I have made preparations for that possibility as well. I hope she forgives me for all of it." Nora read the entry twice and then closed the journal and held it in her hands and stood at the window of the empty bedroom, looking out at the gray Nevada afternoon. Outside, somewhere on this 200 acres of apparently worthless land, there were 12 locations. Somewhere among those locations was a collection that a man had spent 40 years building in careful silence because he believed or had come to believe that he was building it for her. She did not know yet what position W meant. She did not know what preparations Silas had made or what he hoped she would forgive him for or what exactly Richard Voss knew and how long he had known it. But she understood 2 things clearly. The first was that the $50,000 offer had not been generosity. It had been urgency. Men who genuinely believed land was worthless did not install monitoring equipment on it and drive out in Cadillacs within hours of a deed transfer. The second was that whatever was buried on this land, someone else had been waiting for it for a long time. That evening, after Ren had fallen asleep on the less damaged of the 2 remaining mattresses they had found in the back of the house, Nora sat in the kitchen with Silas's journals open before her and the map laid flat on the table and the heavy key sitting where she could see it. Patch had settled under the table with his head on her foot, and the silence of the Nevada desert came in through the open window, a different quality of silence than Oklahoma, drier and more complete. She studied the map until the symbols began to yield something. The circles, she was fairly certain, marked the vault locations. 12 of them scattered across the property in a pattern that looked random, but probably wasn't. The single square marked with the letter W and placed at a spot that her rough calculations put near a dry creek bed in the northeast quarter of the property was something else. Position W is not a vault, Silas had written. It was a witness. She did not know yet what that meant. But she turned it over in her mind the way you turn over a stone you intend to look under, not yet, but soon. Outside, the desert made no sound. The stars over Nevada were extravagant and indifferent, the kind of sky that makes human concerns feel briefly small and briefly bearable. Nora sat at the table in the ruined kitchen of a house left to her by a man she had never met, a man who had watched over her from a distance for 36 years, and she thought about what it meant to love someone through planning rather than presence. She thought her mother had done the same thing in her own way. The careful quiet of Agnes Calloway, her precise small economies, the way she had taught Nora to pay attention to things rather than to emotions, to look at what was actually there rather than what she wished was there. She had always thought of those qualities as her mother's armor against grief. She wondered now if they had also been a kind of preparation. The photograph of Agnes and Silas under the oak tree was propped against the salt shaker where she could see it. Her mother was laughing full and unguarded, and Silas was laughing too, and the tree behind them was enormous and solitary against the flat desert sky. The old oak grows alone, his letter had said. She would find it in the morning. She did not know yet what she would find when she got there, or that Richard Voss would be back before she was ready, or that the 48 hours he had mentioned was not a negotiating timeline, but a countdown of a different kind. She did not know yet about the ropes she would see in the back of his truck, or what they were for, or how close things would come before they came right. What she knew, sitting in the quiet kitchen with Silas's journals and her mother's laughing face in a photograph, and $17 that were no longer the most pressing fact about her situation, was that she was not as alone as she had believed herself to be for the past 2 years. Someone had been watching over her the whole time. Someone had been building something for her patiently across decades with the particular devotion of a person who understood that the best gift you could give someone was not money, but the means to stand without needing it. She closed the journals and stacked them carefully. She went to the window and stood looking out at the dark Nevada land that was hers. Now all 200 acres of it, the scrub and the silence and whatever lay beneath the surface, waiting for the right hands to find it. Then she went to get a few hours of sleep because tomorrow she was going to find that oak tree, and she intended to be ready. The oak tree was exactly where the photograph had placed it, standing alone in the northeast quarter of the property on a slight rise that gave it a clear view of everything around it for a quarter-mile in every direction. It was larger in person than it had appeared in the photograph, the trunk thick enough that Nora could not have circled it with her arms. The canopy spread wide against the pale Nevada morning in the particular way of trees that have grown without competition, reaching outward rather than upward, taking whatever space was available because nothing else was competing for it. She stood at the base of it and put her hand flat against the bark and felt the roughness of it, the deep furrows of old growth, and thought about her mother standing in the same spot sometime in 1976 with her brother beside her, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Wren was already moving around the trunk, examining the bark with the systematic attention she brought to everything. Patch circled wide, her nose working the ground, reading the long record of what had passed through this place. Here, Wren said from the far side of the trunk. The carvings were on the south face, the side that would have been in shadow for most of the day, and therefore less exposed to weather, which was why they had survived as well as they had. Someone had cut them deep, not casual scratching, but deliberate incision, the kind of work that takes time and intention. There were 2 sets. The first set was 3 sequences of numbers arranged vertically, each sequence 6 digits long. Nora looked at them and felt the answer arrive before she had consciously assembled it. The first sequence was 031971. The second was 082009. She did not recognize the third immediately, 061298, and then she did. June 12, 1998. The day she had married Clem, on a Saturday afternoon in a Baptist church in Enid with 30 people in attendance, and her mother in a blue dress sitting in the front row with her hands folded in her lap, and an expression on her face that Nora had thought at the time was happiness, and now understood might have been something more complicated. Someone had known the date of her wedding. Someone had carved it into a tree in Nevada. Mom, Wren said quietly, "Look down here." Below the number sequences, near the base of the trunk, where the bark met the soil and a tangle of surface roots made the ground uneven, was a second carving. Smaller, more worn, cut at an angle that suggested someone kneeling rather than standing. The letters were harder to read because the bark had grown slightly around them over the years, but they were legible if you knew to look. The real treasure isn't in the ground. It's in the knowing. A.M., her mother's initials. Nora crouched and traced the letters with her fingertip. The bark was rough and dry under her touch. She tried to calculate when these might have been cut based on how much the bark had grown around the edges of the incision, and thought probably sometime in the 1990s, which meant her mother had been here, had stood in this specific place and carved these specific words into this specific tree, and had never said a word about it to her daughter. "What does it mean?" Wren said. The real treasure isn't in the ground. Nora was quiet for a moment. I'm not sure yet, she said, but I think your grandmother was smarter than either of us knew. She stood and took out the map from her jacket pocket and oriented herself by the tree which the map showed clearly as a reference point. 30 paces north, then 20 paces west. She counted them out, Wren watching Patch following at her heel. The spot she arrived at looked like every other spot on this ground scrub grass and hard-packed earth and a small scatter of rocks that might have been placed there or might have arrived by other means over many years. She drove the spade into the ground. The soil here was different from the ground around it. Not obviously not to the eye but to the spade. It was different, slightly less compacted, as though it had been disturbed at some point in the past and had not entirely returned to its original density. She felt it in the resistance, or rather in the slight lack of it, and she dug with more focus. At 18 inches, the spade hit metal. She and Wren cleared the dirt from around the edges of what the spade had found working carefully, and what emerged was not a box in the ordinary sense, but a vault door, a heavy plate of steel set into a concrete form that extended down into the earth. The whole assembly far too large and heavy to have been moved once it was placed. It had been built here, built into the ground like a foundation, like something intended to be permanent. 4 lock mechanisms were set into the door's face. 1 was a keyhole. 3 were combination dials. Nora took the heavy key from her jacket pocket and inserted it into the keyhole. It turned with the smooth resistance of a well-made lock, and she felt the first mechanism release. She looked at the 3 combination dials, and then at Wren, and Wren was already looking at the tree. The number sequences, Wren said, the dates. They went back to the tree, and Wren copied the numbers into the small notebook she kept in her bag. Then they returned to the vault, and Nora turned the first combination dial to 031971. She felt its seat. She moved to the second dial and turned it to 082009 and felt that 1 seat too. The third dial she turned to 061298. For a moment, nothing happened. Then from inside the steel, the sound of multiple mechanisms moving in sequence, a series of heavy clicks like the deliberate footsteps of something large and certain, and the vault door shifted upward a quarter inch as the pressure equalized. Nora and Wren looked at each other. Nora pulled the door open. The vault was approximately 4 feet deep and 6 feet across, lined in cedar wood that still held its smell after however many years it had been sealed. Inside were wooden boxes, 8 of them, each one approximately the size of a large dictionary, each one labeled in handwriting she recognized from the journals. The labels were precise and comprehensive. Dates, coin types, grades, quantities. The first box she lifted was almost shockingly heavy for its size, the density of metal concentrating weight into a small space. She opened it. The coins inside were each in individual protective holders. The plastic yellowed slightly at the edges, but intact, the coins themselves catching the morning light in a way that made Wren inhale sharply. Gold, mostly the particular warm color of old American gold coinage, the surfaces preserving details that should by rights have been worn away decades ago. 1933 Double Eagle, the label inside the box lid read, 12 specimens, last appraised value, $2.1 million per specimen. Wren did the arithmetic faster than Nora did. That's 1 box, she said, 1 box in 1 vault, and the map shows 12 vaults. Nora closed the box carefully and set it back in the vault and stood up and looked across the property. The map showed 12 circles. If each vault held even a fraction of what this first one appeared to hold, then Silas Marsh had not been overstating things in his journals. They were still looking at the open vault when they heard the vehicles. Not 1 vehicle this time. 3, and they were not coming slowly up the dirt track the way the Cadillac had come yesterday. They were coming fast, the kind of speed that does not bother to pretend it has a peaceful purpose. Nora closed the vault door and pushed dirt over it with her boot, and looked around for somewhere to go, and understood in the same moment that there was nowhere. 200 acres of open land, a tree, a farmhouse 300 yards away. She stood up straight instead. 3 trucks came across the property and stopped in a loose arc around the oak tree. 6 men got out. Richard Voss got out last from the lead truck, and he was not wearing the charcoal suit today. He was wearing clothes that were designed to be practical, and his face had shed the practiced hospitality of yesterday, the way a stage set gets struck when the performance is over. He looked at the disturbed ground near the vault, and at the key still in Nora's hand, and at the map she had not had time to put away, and his expression was the expression of a man arriving at a conclusion he had been working toward for a long time. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I see you've been busy." "The offer is off the table," she said. "We both know it was never really about the land." Voss tilted his head slightly, something that might have been appreciation or might have been the look a man gets when he recalibrates. "You're right," he said. "It wasn't." He looked at the vault door beneath its thin cover of displaced dirt and then back at her. "Here is where we are. You have found the first location. Good for you. There are 11 more and I need someone with legal standing to access them. That's you." He paused. "The offer is now $30,000 and a car ride to the county line when we are finished." "And if I say no," Nora said. His eyes moved to Wren standing close to her mother's shoulder and back to Nora. "Then I would say that $30,000 and a car ride is a better outcome than the alternative." His voice was entirely conversational, the way a man is conversational when he has made a decision he is comfortable with and does not feel the need to perform it. One of his men stepped forward and took the map from her hand. Another took the key. She let them because there was nothing else to do, because 6 men and the open Nevada desert are a geometry that does not leave much room for decisions. They opened the vault. Voss watched his men lift the boxes out and begin loading them into one of the trucks, and his face was the face of someone seeing a number become real. He had known something was here. Now he was seeing what something meant. "The 1933 Double Eagles alone," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then louder. 12 locations. Let's not waste time." They moved to the second location. Voss had done his research because he had a copy of the map, or a version of it close enough that he directed his men to the correct general area without needing Nora's guidance, though he kept her close. The second vault was larger than the first, requiring 3 men to clear the dirt from around the door, and when it was opened, Voss stood at the edge and looked down into it for a long moment without speaking. Silver this time primarily, Morgan dollars in mint sets that had not been opened since the 1880s, commemorative pieces from expositions and anniversaries, an 1804 bust dollar in a protective case that Voss's man held up to the light and then set down with exaggerated care. "How much?" Voss said. "15 million in this location by the catalog in the lid," Nora said. She had read it while they were clearing the door. Voss said nothing. He was doing mathematics that were clearly revising his earlier estimates upward. It was Wren who saw it first. She had been standing slightly behind Nora, and she had been watching not the vault, but the trucks, the way a person watches something that is worrying them without wanting to show that it is worrying them. She touched Nora's elbow the lightest possible pressure, and when Nora glanced at her, she moved her eyes toward the lead truck. Nora looked. In the bed of Voss's lead truck, visible because the tailgate was down and the afternoon light caught them clearly, were coils of heavy rope and a stack of folded burlap sacking. Not the ropes you bring to a dig site, not the sacking of someone who plans to leave witnesses. Nora understood in a single cold moment what she was looking at and what it meant about the timeline Voss was working on. He needed her signature. He needed her legal cooperation to authenticate and transfer the coins through proper channels, because without provenance documentation from the rightful heir, a collection of this magnitude was worth a fraction of its value on the black market. But he did not need her after the signing, and he had not brought those materials because he planned to drive them to a county line when the work was finished. She kept her face exactly as it had been. She said to Voss, "You said the collection needs proper legal documentation to sell at full value. Without the heir's signature, you're looking at black market prices. 10 cents on the dollar." Voss looked at her with something that might have been respect if it had belonged to a different person. "That's correct. So you need us alive and cooperative. At least for now." His jaw shifted slightly. You're a practical woman, Mrs. Calloway. That's useful. What I'm saying, she continued, keeping her voice at the same register, is that you should think carefully about the timeline here. Authentication doesn't happen in an afternoon. The buyers your people have identified will need documentation prepared by a lawyer. That takes days, not hours. She was not saying this to negotiate. She was saying it to buy time to push the rope and burlap further back in his thinking, to make herself and Ren more valuable as living participants in a process than as a problem to be managed. And she was saying it because she was trying to remember what Silas had written in the final journal entry. The words that had seemed cryptic when she read them the night before, and that now had the quality of a door she needed to find the handle of. Position W will tell her what she needs to know. I have made preparations for that possibility as well. They moved to the third location marked on the map. Voss directed his men to an area near the dry creek bed in the northeast corner of the property. They drove the iron probe rods into the ground in a systematic grid and found nothing. They expanded the grid and found nothing. The ground here was a different character from the vault sites, not the slightly disturbed softness she had felt with her spade that morning, but solid caliche undisturbed for decades. One of Voss's men said, "Nothing here, boss, just bedrock." Voss studied the map. "Check the coordinates again." They checked. They were in the right place. Nora said nothing, but she was looking at the map which Voss's man was holding at an angle she could see, and she was noticing something she had not had time to notice before, which was that the symbol at the third location was different from the symbols at the other 11 sites. Not a circle, a square, with the letter W at its center. Her breath came in carefully and went out carefully. Position W, she thought. She looked at the surrounding land, the dry creek bed, the scattered scrub, the sky above Nevada, going the particular deep blue of late afternoon. Nothing moved. No sound except the wind and the scrape of probe rods against stone. Voss was growing impatient. The deliberate control of the earlier hours was beginning to show its edges. He had anticipated a straightforward extraction, an intimidated widow, a cooperative search, a predictable resolution. What he was finding instead was that the land was larger and more complex than his research had accounted for, that the vault system was more sophisticated than he had expected, and that the woman he was pressuring was not behaving with the predictable anxiety he had planned for. "There is nothing here," one of his men said again. Voss turned to Nora. "What does position W mean?" She looked at him. "I read the same journals you did," she said. "Less of them, probably." It was the wrong answer, and she knew it. His face went to a place that was past impatience and past calculation, a place that was simpler and more dangerous. He nodded to two of his men, and one of them moved to stand closer to Ren. Nora felt something in her chest go very cold and very still. "Tell me what you know about position W," Voss said. His voice had returned to its conversational register, which was worse than if he had raised it. Ren had gone completely quiet. She was not showing fear, which in another moment Nora might have been proud of, but this was not a moment for pride. This was a moment to keep her daughter in the category of things that were still all right. "I know what was in the journal," Nora said, "which is that the third position is marked differently. Silas called it a witness, not a vault." "What does that mean?" "I don't know," she said. And it was true. She did not know exactly what it meant. She had an idea taking shape built from fragments Silas's careful planning, the 15-year timeline of his preparations. The phrase, "I have made preparations for that possibility as well." But the idea was not complete yet, and she needed more time for it to become complete. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "We'll come back to position W. There are 9 more vault locations. We'll work those first." They began moving toward the 4th location. The sun was dropping toward the western edge of the Nevada plateau, the light going amber and horizontal. They had perhaps an hour of useful daylight left, maybe less, and Voss was moving with more urgency now, the impatience barely contained beneath the surface. Nora walked between two of his men and kept her mind working. Silas had known Voss was watching the property. He had known that someone might come before Nora was ready, might use force, might put her and her daughter in exactly this position. He had written about it explicitly. He had said Position W would tell her what she needed to know. He had said he had made preparations. The preparation was not a vault. It was a witness. She thought about the word carefully. Not a thing. A person. She thought about the monitoring equipment. Voss had mentioned, the cameras and motion sensors. Voss had installed them after Silas's death. But Silas had known Voss was coming, which meant Silas might have had his own system installed earlier, watching different things. The fourth vault yielded more gold. Voss's men were loading the trucks with the systematic efficiency of people who had done this kind of work before, and the trucks were getting heavy. He's been planning this for 3 years, Wren said quietly, walking close to Nora. Since before Uncle Silas died. Longer, Nora said. Silas wrote that Voss made the first approach 4 years ago. Wren was quiet for a moment. Then, someone knew we were coming here. Someone besides Voss. Nora looked at her daughter. The lawyer, Wren said. Harlan Oakes in Reno. He filed the deed transfer. He would have known the moment we appeared in the county to claim the property. Nora thought about this. She thought about the network of preparation that the journal suggested, 40 years of meticulous planning, a man who had arranged buyers in advance and pre-hired lawyers and set up accounts and considered every contingency he could imagine. A man like that would not leave the most vulnerable moment, the moment of transfer, the moment when his heir arrived at the property, unobserved and unprotected. Position W will tell her what she needs to know. The witness was not a what, it was a who. She did not say this to Wren because saying it aloud would mean Voss's men heard it, and the one thing she needed to protect right now was the idea that Position W was a dead end, an empty location, a mystery that had no answer. As long as Voss thought Position W was a hole in the ground that happened to have no vault, he would keep moving to the other locations and burning the last of the daylight, and she needed that time. The fifth vault location was near the collapsed barn. Voss's man drove his probe rod into the ground and hit stone immediately. Empty, he said. Same as Position 3. Wait, Voss said. He looked at the map more carefully. He looked at Nora. There were 12 circles on the map and 1 square. But now with the afternoon light at a different angle than the morning, she could see something she had not seen before. Some of the circles had a small additional mark, a dot at their center. Others did not. She counted quickly. 8 circles with center dots, 4 without. 8 vaults they had accessed or would access. And 4 locations that were something else marked like vaults, but not vaults, distributed around the property at what she now understood were not random positions, but cardinal positions, north, south, east, west, and Position W was the western one. Not witness. West. She felt the idea rearrange itself, and the new shape was better, more complete. The 4 blank positions were not failed vaults. They were points on a compass. And the center of that compass, the point equidistant from all 4 of them, was somewhere in the middle of the property. Somewhere she had not been yet. Somewhere that was not on the map at all, because Silas had not put it on the map, because putting it on the map would have been giving away the most important thing to anyone who found the map under the wrong circumstances. The real treasure isn't in the ground, her mother had written. It's in the knowing. Her mother had not been talking about the coin collection. She had been talking about the knowledge of how to find what was actually central. The thing that Silas had hidden at the true heart of the property, by hiding the instructions for finding it in plain sight, carved into the bark of a tree in her mother's handwriting, where only someone who understood the family and knew to look would understand what it meant. It's in the knowing. She had almost assembled it completely when the sound came. Distant at first, and then less distant, and then clearly real and approaching. Not one sound, but many layered together. Hoofbeats, multiple horses moving at a pace that was not casual, coming from the direction of the county road. Voss's men stopped what they were doing. Voss himself went very still, in the particular way of a man who has suddenly recalculated. Expecting company, Nora said. His jaw tightened. Nobody knows we're here, Wren said quietly, looking at her mother, position W. West. The county road comes in from the west. The hoofbeats were close enough now to resolve into individual rhythms, 6 horses at least, possibly more, moving with coordinated purpose. The last of the afternoon light was catching the dust they raised, making it glow amber at the western edge of the property. Voss turned to his men and gave a series of rapid instructions, and his men began moving toward the trucks, and Nora took Wren's hand and held it firmly. Whatever was coming from the west, Silas Marsh had planned for it. He had placed that marker deliberately, had called it a witness, had told her in the last shaking lines he ever wrote that he had made preparations for exactly this possibility. He had spent 2 years, the final 2 years of his life, building something more complex than a hiding place. He had built a trap, and he had built it around a man who had been circling the property for 3 years, waiting for exactly the right moment to close in. The riders crested the low rise at the western edge of the property and came into view, and Nora could see in the fading Nevada light that they were not the casual kind. They were the prepared kind. And she understood, standing in the gathering dark with her daughter's hand in hers, and Richard Voss behind her, recalculating everything he thought he knew, that she had been the last piece. She had been the element Silas needed to be present before the trap could close. The deed had gone to her. The journals had gone to her. The map and the key and the photograph had gone to her. And the moment she arrived and began to dig, she had started a clock that someone somewhere had been waiting a long time to hear. Position W had not been empty. Position W had been a signal. The riders came down from the western rise in a line that spread as they descended, fanning out across the property with the practiced efficiency of people who had rehearsed this exact approach. There were 8 of them, and in the last amber light of the Nevada evening, Nora could see that several wore the kind of clothing that announced official business without requiring a uniform to do it. The particular combination of practical gear and visible authority that belonged to people who operated in the space between civilian and law. Voss moved fast. He grabbed Nora's arm and pulled her in front of him, putting her between himself and the approaching riders, and his grip was not gentle. Wren took a step forward and one of his remaining men blocked her. "Stay where you are," Voss said to the riders. His voice had lost its conversational quality entirely. What remained was something harder and less practiced. "I have the property owner here. This is a legal transaction in progress. Anyone who interferes is obstructing a lawful commercial negotiation." The lead rider pulled up 20 yards out and dismounted in a single easy motion. She was a woman in her mid-40s, compact and deliberate in her movements, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of face that had made and kept a great many decisions. She wore no uniform, but she carried herself with the settled authority of someone who did not need one. "Mrs. Calloway," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the evening air. "My name is Hattie Breck. You can let her go, Mr. Voss. You are currently surrounded by 7 licensed Nevada peace officers operating under a private security contract, and 3 of them are also holding active federal marshal credentials. Whatever legal theory you're working with right now, I promise it gets worse from here." Voss's grip on Nora's arm did not release immediately. She could feel him calculating, running the numbers on a situation that had shifted faster than he had planned for. His men were at the trucks, which were loaded with coins from 5 open vaults, and the trucks were surrounded by riders who had positioned themselves with the deliberateness of people who had mapped this ground before arriving on it. "Let go of my arm," Nora said. Her voice was quiet and entirely level. He let go. 2 of Breck's riders moved immediately to Voss and had his hand secured before he had time to make a different decision. The other men offered less resistance than Nora had expected. She understood, watching them, that the appearance of numbers and authority had done most of the work. These were hired men, not committed ones. The calculation of personal cost had shifted visibly on each of their faces the moment the riders crested the rise. Wren came to her mother's side, and Nora put her arm around her daughter's shoulders and held on. Breck walked toward them across the scrub grass, and up close she had the particular quality of someone who had been awake for a very long time and was accustomed to it. She looked at Nora with an attention that felt familiar, the way a person looks at someone they have been told a great deal about. He held you at gunpoint, Breck said. That correct. His men had guns visible, Nora said. He made the implication clear. That's enough. Breck glanced at Wren. You all right, Wren said. I'm fine. What's in position W? Breck looked at her for a moment with something that might have been amusement under other circumstances. A GPS transmitter, she said, set to broadcast on a specific frequency the moment anyone applied pressure to the ground above it. Your great-uncle buried it there 15 years ago and gave us the receiver frequency. The moment Voss's man drove a probe rod into that ground tonight, we had the signal. He dug at position W, Nora said. He sent his men there because he thought it was a vault location. He thought it was a vault location because your uncle wanted him to think so, Breck said. Silas Marsh spent a long time thinking about how a man like Voss would behave if he came here under the wrong conditions. He thought about it very carefully. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and produced a sealed envelope. The paper was the same yellowed stock as the letter that had arrived in Oklahoma 6 days ago, and Nora's name was on the front in the same cramped, precise handwriting. He told me to give this to you only if someone threatened you or your daughter while attempting to access the property, Breck said. If you'd arrived and claimed the inheritance peacefully, this letter was to be destroyed unopened. His instructions. Nora took the envelope. She did not open it immediately. She stood holding it while Breck's people moved through the property with a systematic efficiency that suggested they had been briefed on its layout, directing Voss's men away from the trucks, beginning the process of documenting what had been removed from the vaults, working with the unhurried confidence of people executing a plan that had been in place for a long time. Voss sat on the ground with his hands secured, and for the first time since the Cadillac had come up the dirt road the previous morning, he looked like a man who did not know what the next hour held. He was watching Breck's people with an expression that was moving through stages from calculation to reassessment to something that was beginning to resemble the early arrival of understanding. You knew, he said to Nora. You knew they were coming. Nora looked at him. I knew my uncle was a careful man, she said. I didn't know exactly what careful meant until tonight. He said nothing else. Nora opened the letter. It was 3 pages written in the same handwriting as the journals, slightly shakier in the later pages, the letters of a man working against physical difficulty to say what needed to be said. She read it standing in the Nevada evening with Wren reading beside her and Breck standing a respectful distance away. Silas Marsh had begun the letter by apologizing, not in the elaborate way of someone performing contrition, but in the direct way of someone who had identified a specific failure and wanted to name it plainly. He had stayed away from her life because he had believed that distance was protection, that a man with a hidden fortune and a known enemy was safer to the people he loved, if those people did not know he existed. He had been wrong about this, he wrote, or at least he had been wrong to believe it was his decision to make alone. Agnes had told him so more than once, and Agnes had been right, and he was sorry he had not listened while there was still time. He wrote about the collection. The true value as of the most recent independent appraisals, arranged through 3 separate auction houses, was $147 million. The appraisal documents were held in a sealed strongbox at the First Nevada Bank in Reno, in a vault registered to the estate. The key to that strongbox, he wrote, was in the possession of his attorney, Harlan Oakes, who had been instructed to release it to Nora upon presentation of the inheritance deed and a valid identity document. Oakes had also been retained to manage the legal transfer of the collection to her ownership, a process he estimated would take 48 hours, given the documentation Silas had spent years preparing in advance. He wrote about the buyers, 12 individuals and institutions, each one vetted over years of careful research, each one specializing in a different category of the collection, each one already contacted and confirmed, willing to purchase at full market value. The contact information and the terms already negotiated were in a second document held by Oakes, along with a letter of introduction from Silas that would ensure Nora was received not as a stranger, but as the continuation of a relationship these buyers had maintained with her uncle for decades. He wrote about the trust. Before his death, he had established an irrevocable educational trust in Wren's name funded at $2 million, structured to cover tuition, housing, and living expenses at any accredited university she chose to attend, with the remainder to be released to her at age 25. The trust documents were with Oakes. He wrote about Hattie Breck. He had hired her security firm in 1994, 15 years before his death, after the first approach from a company he had identified as a front for Voss's organization. He had paid a retainer that was renewed annually, had provided updated intelligence on Voss's activities each year, and had established the trigger protocol for the envelope she now held. Breck and her people had been monitoring the property remotely since his death. They had watched Voss's men install their cameras and sensors with something his letter described with a dry precision that made Nora almost smile as considerable professional interest. He wrote about Voss specifically. For the last 2 years of his life, Silas had been funding a private investigation into Voss's organization, documenting the pattern of targeting families with inherited assets of significant value, using intimidation and, in some documented cases, violence, to acquire those assets at fraudulent prices or through outright theft. The investigative file, 5 years of documented cases involving 14 families across 6 western states, had been provided to federal authorities 8 months before Silas's death. The case had been building since then, waiting for Voss to commit a prosecutable offense under federal jurisdiction in the presence of sufficient witness testimony. Tonight, Silas wrote as though he had known exactly how this evening would go. Richard Voss will have provided everything that is needed. Nora read the final paragraph twice. Agnes told me you were stubborn in the way our father was stubborn, which is to say, quietly and completely, and without any performance of it. She told me you had the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself, the kind that just keeps moving when moving is the only reasonable option. I believe she was right. I watched over you the only way I knew how, which was imperfectly and from too far away and through what I could leave behind rather than what I could offer in person. I hope it is enough. I hope you will build something with what I am giving you that is yours and not mine, because the one thing I know about legacy is that it only means something when the person who receives it makes it their own. You are Agnes's daughter. I have no doubt you will know what to do. Wren had finished reading before Nora had. She was standing with her arms crossed over her chest and her chin up, and when Nora looked at her, she saw that her daughter's eyes were bright, but her expression was steady. He never met either of us, Wren said, and he did all of this. Nora folded the letter carefully along its original creases. Hattie Breck came to stand beside them. The property is secured, she said. Voss's men are detained pending arrival of county sheriff's deputies who are approximately 20 minutes out. Voss himself will be transferred to federal custody tonight. The case your uncle built has been waiting for a triggering event for 8 months. Tonight is that event. What happens to the vaults, Nora said, the ones his men open? Everything that was removed has been documented and will be returned to your legal custody once the chain of evidence is established. Should take about 72 hours. Oakes is already aware and will coordinate with you. Nora looked across the darkening property. The 5 vaults that had been opened were visible as disturbances in the ground, raw edges of earth against the scrub. 7 more were out there somewhere, sealed and intact, holding the rest of what Silas had spent his life accumulating. The 4th compass point, she said to Breck. Not north, south, east, west. There's a center point, something Silas didn't put on the map. Breck looked at her with attention. What makes you say that? 4 blank positions arranged at cardinal points, Nora said. My mother carved a message on the oak tree. The real treasure isn't in the ground. It's in the knowing. I thought she meant the buyer list, the legal framework, but I think she might have meant something else too. Something Silas kept off the map entirely. Breck was quiet for a moment. His attorney might be able to answer that, she said. He left a sealed set of instructions with Oakes that were described to me as supplemental. I was told they would make sense to the right person in the right moment. The right hands, Wren said quietly. That's what it said on the first photograph. What's buried stays buried until the right hands find it. Nora looked at her daughter. Then she looked at the oak tree, visible as a dark mass against the evening sky at the rise of the property. Tomorrow, she said, tonight we sleep. The county sheriff's deputies arrived as promised, and the federal transfer of Voss took another hour beyond that, and by the time the last vehicle had gone down the dirt track and the property was quiet again, it was well past 10 at night. Breck left two of her people stationed at the property perimeter and drove away with a card pressed into Nora's hand that had a phone number and the instruction to call if anything moved on the property that shouldn't. Nora and Wren slept on the mattresses in the back bedroom with Patch between them, and Nora slept better than she had in 2 years, which surprised her because the day had been the kind of day that should produce sleeplessness. But there was something in the resolution of sustained tension that worked like a sedative, the dropping away of a weight she had not fully known she was carrying. And she went under quickly and stayed under until the early gray light of Nevada morning came through the empty window frame. She drove to Reno the next day with Wren and the inheritance deed and her driver's license. And Harlan Oaks turned out to be a small man in his 60s with a precisely organized office and the manner of someone who had been waiting for this specific appointment for a long time. He had the strong box key ready. He had the buyer contact documents ready. He had the trust documents for Wren ready, and he placed them in front of Wren directly and explained them to her directly, which Nora appreciated because it acknowledged that Wren was a participant in this and not just a bystander. He also had the supplemental instructions. They were in a sealed envelope like the others, and like the others, they were in Silas's handwriting, and like the others, they began with an apology and moved quickly past it to the practical. The center of the compass Silas had written is the house. Under the foundation of the ranch house poured when the house was built in 1954 and accessible through a panel in the floor of the root cellar that Nora had not found because she had not known to look for a root cellar was a final vault. Not a coin vault, a document vault. It held the originals of every appraisal, every authentication certificate, every provenance document for every piece in the collection, accumulated across 40 years and stored in archival conditions. It held a complete record of every communication with every buyer. It held the investigative files on Voss's organization and physical copy. And it held one more thing which Silas described in the supplemental letter as the most important thing, more important than the coins, more important than the money they would become. It held the correspondence between Silas and Agnes. 40 years of letters he wrote. Everything we said to each other that we could not say to anyone else. Everything she told me about you as you were growing up. The reports of a mother who was prouder of her daughter than she knew how to say directly. I kept every letter. I could not take them with me, and I could not give them to anyone but you. They are yours. They always were. Nora sat in Harlan Oakes' office and held the supplemental instructions and did not speak for a moment. Wren put her hand on her mother's arm and did not say anything either, which was exactly right. They found the root cellar that afternoon accessed through a trap door beneath a piece of loose flooring in what had once been the kitchen, and the panel in its floor was exactly where Silas had described it. The document vault was dry and cool and intact, and inside it were archival boxes stacked with the precision of a man who had organized them over many years, and at the bottom of the rightmost stack, tied with a piece of ordinary kitchen twine, were the letters. There were hundreds of them, spanning from 1969 to 2001, the year Agnes died. The handwriting changed across the decades, younger and looser, in the early ones more settled in the middle years, and in the final letters from Agnes, the ones written in the last months before her death. Something that Nora recognized as the particular clarity people sometimes achieve when they understand that time is becoming specific. She did not read them in the root cellar. She carried them up into the daylight and sat on the porch of the ruined house with Wren beside her and Patch in the yard, and she read the first one and the last one, and then sat holding the rest of them in her lap. The last letter from Agnes to Silas was dated March of 2001, 6 weeks before her death. It was not long. She's going to be all right, Agnes had written. She married a good man, and she has her father's stubbornness about the things that matter, which means she will keep going when going is hard. I am not worried about her in the ways I used to be worried. I am only sorry I will not be there to see what she builds. Tell her when the time comes that I was proud of her the whole time, even when I didn't say it. Especially then. Nora sat on the porch of the ruined ranch house in Mineral County, Nevada, in the October afternoon, and held her mother's last letter, and for the first time since January of 2007, she cried without trying to stop herself. Wren sat beside her and did not try to fix it. She just stayed, which was what was needed, and which told Nora something about her daughter that she had probably known for a long time without finding the exact words for it. The sale of the collection took 4 months. Harlan Oakes managed the process with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything, working through Silas's pre-arranged buyer list in the order Silas had specified, each transaction clean and documented and conducted at full market value. There were no middlemen. There were no auction house commissions beyond what had been negotiated in advance. There were no surprises in the legal structure because Silas had anticipated every one of them and built around it. The final total after taxes and fees and the $2 million already transferred into Wren's educational trust was $143 million. Nora sat with Harlan Oakes in his office in Reno on the day the final transaction cleared and looked at the number on the document in front of her for a long time without speaking. "It doesn't look real," she said finally. "It rarely does," Oakes said. "In my experience, the people for whom it looks most real are the ones who should have it least." She bought land in Colorado, 3,000 acres in a valley between two mountain ranges where the grass was good and the water rights were clear, and the nearest town was 11 miles away on a paved road. She bought it in November and spent the winter having the house built, a real house this time, with insulation and windows that fit their frames and a porch that ran the full length of the south side to catch the afternoon light. She designed it herself mostly, with an architect who listened more than he talked, and the result was something that felt like it had been there for decades, even when it was new. She paid off the Oklahoma farm in full and signed it over to the Petworth family, who had been checking on her livestock since October and who had 3 children and a mortgage that was not unlike the one she had been carrying. She did this without announcement and asked Harlan Oakes to handle the paperwork so there would be no conversation about it required. She hired 4 people in the first spring, all of them from within a 30-mile radius. All of them known to her through the kind of local network that exists in agricultural communities. People who had lost land or work in the previous years and who knew livestock and irrigation and the particular demanding patience of working with the land rather than against it. She paid them wages that were not charitable, but were honest, which she thought was more respectful than charity. And she gave them housing on the property because housing in the valley was expensive, and the alternative was a 2-hour commute that would have made the wages meaningless. The horses came gradually, mostly through Wren, who had a specific interest in animals that had been misused, and an equally specific talent for the slow work of rebuilding their trust. By the following spring, there were 31 horses on the property, and Wren had become the kind of person that other people in the valley called, when they had a horse they didn't know what to do with, which was not a category of expertise that Wren had planned for, but which appeared to suit her. Wren enrolled at the University of Colorado in the fall, taking the scholarship money from Silas's trust and studying education because she had decided at some point during the Nevada ordeal, or in the months after it, that the thing she wanted to do with her particular intelligence was give it away systematically to people who needed it. She drove home on weekends more often than Nora expected, and on those weekends she worked with the horses and read in the evenings and ate dinner with her mother at the table on the porch when the weather allowed, which in Colorado in autumn was more often than you might expect. Hattie Breck came to the Colorado property in the spring, 7 months after the Nevada night, driving a truck that was not a Cadillac and arriving without announcement, which was consistent with everything Nora had come to understand about her. She sat on the porch with Nora and a cup of coffee and delivered the news about Voss in the direct way she delivered everything. Federal court, she said, 35 years, no possibility of early release. He argued the coins were in the ground when he arrived and therefore subject to salvage rights, which is the kind of legal theory that sounds almost reasonable until a federal judge explains why it isn't. The investigative files your uncle built were the foundation of the case. 14 other families testified. The organization is finished. Nora looked out at the valley. The afternoon light was doing what afternoon light does in Colorado in April, making everything slightly more real than it needs to be. There's something else, Breck said. We recovered assets in the seizure. Other collections similar to your uncle's, but taken rather than inherited. $412 million across multiple storage locations. The legal process for returning those assets to the families they were taken from is going to take years, but it's underway. Nora thought about that for a moment. 14 families, she said. At minimum, Breck said. Those are the ones we could document. Voss had been operating in this particular way for 11 years. She sat with the coffee and the April light and thought about her uncle spending the last 2 years of his life building a case against a man who had threatened what he had spent 40 years creating. Not for his own protection, because he had known by then that he would not live to see it resolved, but for the 14 families, and possibly more, who would otherwise have been left with no recourse. Some people, Nora said, have a very large idea of what they owe to other people. Breck said, your uncle was one of them. So was your mother, from what I understand of her. They sat in the April afternoon for a while longer, not needing to say much, and Patch slept in the sun at the edge of the porch, and the horses moved in the lower pasture, and the mountains sat in their permanent way against the sky. After Breck left, Nora went inside and took the letters from the box where she kept them. The letters from Agnes to Silas across 40 years, and brought them out to the porch table. She did not read them again. She had read them all by now slowly over the winter months, a few at a time. She just held them in their tied bundle and looked at the valley and thought about what it meant that her mother had been corresponding with a brother Nora had never known, sending him reports of a daughter's growing up a daughter who had not known she was being witnessed. She thought about what Silas had written, that he had watched over her the only way he knew how, which was from a distance and through what he could leave behind. She thought about the oak tree with her mother's words carved near the root, low enough that you had to kneel to read it. The real treasure isn't in the ground. It's in the knowing. Her mother had not meant the buyer list or the legal framework or even the letters. She had meant this. The knowledge that you were loved by people you didn't know about in ways you couldn't see across distances that felt like absence but were actually a different kind of presence. The knowledge that the people who came before you had thought about your future with a care that outlasted their lives. That was what you couldn't take with you. That was what they had left behind instead. The sun went down behind the western mountains, and the valley went the deep blue of Colorado evenings, and Nora sat on the porch. She had designed herself on land. She had chosen herself and watched the light change on the peaks, and thought about Clem, who had also loved her in a way she had not always known how to see clearly while it was happening, and about her mother who had been proud of her the whole time, even when she didn't say it, and about a man she had never met who had watched over her girl from a distance for 36 years. She was 38 years old. She had $17 in a foreclosure notice and an unknown name on an envelope in what felt like another life now, though it had been 6 months ago. She had a daughter who was becoming something extraordinary. She had land and work and the specific satisfaction of building something that was hers. She had, against all reasonable expectation, more than enough. Patch put his chin on her knee and looked up at her with his old patient eyes, and she put her hand on his head, and they watched the last of the light go off the mountains together, and the stars came out over Colorado, extravagant as they always are at altitude. And Nora Calloway, who had once counted $17 on a kitchen table and believed that was the whole of what she had, sat in the quiet and understood that she had been rich for a very long time without knowing it.